In this video, you will learn about the robbery that took place on Christmas. You will find out how cunningly the criminals approached their case, and you will find out how stupidly they tried to get rid of the persecution. At the end of December, the small city of Cisco was in full swing for the Christmas. Santa Claus was strolling the streets of Texas, and local children were chasing him with cheerful cries. However, no one could have foreseen that a large stockpile of firearms was concealed within the costume. One of the most significant hunts in the history of Texas was launched by an evil Santa who was en route to rob the First National Bank. His thirst for quick cash had turned into a lengthy chase, imprisonment, and eventually a popular lynching. Let's begin at the beginning. I'll reveal all the cards at once. That Santa Claus was Marshall Radcliffe, the criminal. To be more precise, an avid robber. He wasn't very talented because he robbed where he lived. The local chief of police, Bedford, has locked Radcliffe up more than once, but in vain. Radcliffe was released unchanged. There was still a golden light of greed in his eyes. Together with his brother, he was going to raid again. Radcliffe invited two old acquaintances from a neighboring town. They were Helms, Hilla, and Tough-Ass Davis. The latter was ready to commit a desperate crime for the sake of a large sum. At that time, bank robberies were commonplace, but his brother was locked up in prison banks where plans changed. The Bankers Association offered $5,000 to anyone who would stop the raiders. Radcliffe was well aware of this offer. He also understood that everyone in Cisco knew him by sight. Decent volunteers will grab him before he even enters the building, him to come up with something. But the time was approaching Christmas, which means this is the perfect opportunity to successfully pull off the case. A group of robbers stayed at Mrs. Midge Tellett's boarding house. He was a few miles from Cisco. They also borrowed an old Santa Claus costume from her, which she will never want to return. On December 23, 1927, an old car with 4 men inside stopped a few blocks from the bank. Santa Claus got out of the car and walked leisurely down the street. There was a festive mood all around. Shopkeepers decorated the windows. The children pestered Santa Claus, asking what he would give them for Christmas. Radcliffe smiled warmly at them and promised them the most adorable toys. The cheerful kids followed him down the main street. Passers-by were only touched by this festive bustle. No one expected that the joy hovering around would soon turn into a bloody nightmare. Radcliffe walked to the bank accompanied by the children. He patted the little ones on the head and went inside. The cashier noticed him first and greeted him with a festive cheer. Radcliffe did not answer and headed to the center of the hall. Deposits were issued to customers there. Somewhat embarrassed, the cashier repeated his exclamation. Again, no response. Suddenly there was a crash of doors opening. Robert Hill burst into the bank, brandishing a pistol. He pointed the gun at the kid and ordered him to put his hands up. Henry Helms and the last accomplice, Lewis Davis, appeared behind him. Radcliffe took the gun away from the cashier. Then he took a bag out of his pants and ordered the shaking kid to open the safe. While his partners were holding hostages at gunpoint, Santa Claus was stuffing a gift bag with money. Meanwhile, everything was going according to the bandit scenario in the bank. The robbers drove employees and customers into the office. The bank teller, Mr. Smith, was shaking his hands as he emptied the safe of all the cash. The money fit into a fake Santa's fancy Christmas bag. The bandits' loot was $163,000, a rather big jackpot. But then the first shots rang out. The townspeople and policemen running up to the bank began firing at the doors without understanding the purpose. Two robbers guarding the entrance returned fire. A disorderly cannonade began. However, this did not prevent the criminals from acting further. Grabbing 3 hostages and using them as human shields, the robbers left the bank's doors. Their dark blue Buick was parked nearby, which the robbers had parked in advance. The shooting stopped, but several bullets managed to hit the hostages. One of the hostages broke free. The other was screaming hysterically. Apparently his bloody face seemed convincing, so they just let him go. The third hostage was shoved into a car, but in the confusion, he was able to open the door, jump out, and run away. The robbers found that they were completely without hostages. Therefore, those who could not escape were captured. They turned out to be 2 girls, 10 and 12 years old. They dragged them to the car and fired incessantly. Finally, the car was able to move off, and the gang tore away from the city. A hail of bullets flew after them. For some reason, the townspeople did not mind that there were children in the cars. They fired at them indiscriminately. The beaten robbers were glad that they had survived. Radcliffe received only 2 gunshot wounds, one in the cheek, the other in the leg. But Davis wasn't so lucky. He was bleeding out in the back seat. Both remained conscious. Their joy did not last long. The robbers discovered that they had forgotten to refuel before the raid. Only the remnants of gasoline splashed in the tank. The only surviving policeman was Officer Radish. He stocked up on ammunition, a rifle, and ran after the criminals. He was overtaken by armed townspeople in a car, and they followed together. The improvised Avengers were on the heels of the robbers. They were like bloodhounds scenting blood. The criminals were forced to stop. They were looking for a new vehicle. They came across a brand new car. A 14-year-old teenager was driving. They shook the kid out of the cabin and began in a hurry to move the loot into it. That's when the Avengers arrived. A new firefight ensued. Helms and Hill carried the half-dead Davis. The robbers were already ready to get away from their pursuers, but they found that the agile guy pulled the key out of the ignition. The robbers rushed back to the old Buick. At that moment, Hill was hit by a bullet. He howled in pain and climbed into the car. The criminals rushed out of the city, and then a new failure awaited the gang. They left the money in that damn car. The situation was no longer good, but they were still alive. Officer Radis ordered Davis to be taken to the hospital. The doctors fought for his life for a long time, but lost. Davis, whose only crime in life was that ill-fated robbery, has died. The trio broke away for a while. The Avengers caught up with them very quickly. The wounded leaned out of the windows, threw nails, and poured lead on the pursuers. The gasoline was mercilessly decreasing, and then they decided to turn east. The ground broke out from under the wheels in sticky lumps. The race has slowed down. The cars sped through a pasture in an oak forest. Meanwhile, a report of a robbery in Cisco has spread around the county. Sheriff John Hart of Eastland joined the chase. He and his assistants got into the car and drove in the indicated direction. There were reporters in the next car. Behind them, the Rangers rode on horseback, holding rifles at their saddles. The robbers did not yet know about the reinforcements that had arrived. Eastland County has been cordoned off by police around the perimeter. Wherever the criminals went, they would have come across a patrol one way or another. It was only a matter of time before they were caught. Then the police noticed a car crossing the river at high speed. The criminals were identified and rushed after them. A little more and they would have caught up with the scum. But the robbers turned into an oil field. That's what let them down. The police started shooting at the black puddles, which immediately caught fire. The flames drove the criminals from side to side until the car finally overturned. The robbers poured out. Cy Bradford got out of the police car with a rifle. He sat down on one knee, put the butt on his shoulder, took aim, and fired. The first shadow looming on the horizon fell. Bradford inserted a new round into the muzzle, aimed again, and pulled the trigger. The second shadow staggered and fell uncertainly to the ground. After a moment, she slowly got up and trudged on. Bradford loaded his rifle again and fired a third time. The distant shadow knelt down but rose up and hobbled towards the forest. The sheriff rushed to catch up with them, but they had already disappeared behind the trees. Bradford walked over to the man sprawled on the ground. It was Dirty Santa Claus, that is, Radcliffe himself. Helms and Hill were caught on December 30th. The court was like a zoo. The people demanded blood and sacrifices, and he got them. Helms was found guilty of the murders of the Bedford police chief and his first assistant, Carmichael. For this, he was sentenced to death by electric chair. The sentence was executed on September 6, 1929. Hill's partner during the trial cried like a little girl and begged for his life. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Hill repeatedly escaped from prison, but each time the police brought him back. Radcliffe was facing a life sentence. 10-year-old Emma Robinson testified against him. She was a hostage who miraculously escaped after the chase. Upon hearing the verdict, Radcliffe shouted cheerfully.
Yeah.
A month later, the decision was reconsidered and the former Santa Claus was sentenced to death. Then Radcliffe began to behave strangely, feigning insanity. While on temporary detention at Eastland Prison, Ratliff pretended to be paralyzed. When two guards were carrying him to the bathtub, the convict grabbed a pistol from one, killed the second, and tried to shoot the first. The guard pinned down the intruder and put him back in the cell. The very next morning, a raging crowd surrounded the walls of the prison. People chanted curses and demanded Radcliffe's death. The warden had to protect him, but he could not contain the people's anger. 20 people broke into the prison. The people tied Radcliffe hand and foot and dragged him out on a rope. There they put a noose around his neck and hung him on a telephone pole. The rope broke and the immobilized body fell to the ground. This is how the life of a man who robbed a bank on Christmas Eve in a Santa Claus costume ended. With regard to the sole surviving member of the group, Robert Hill, he was released in the latter half of the 1940s. Out of the 99-year sentence assigned to him, he only served 20 years. After that, Hill changed both his first and last names, and nothing further is known regarding his fate. Furthermore, in the city of Cisco, there has been a persistent suspicion of Santa Claus-like individuals on the streets ever since. This suspicion has been unfounded, as nobody robs banks in this city anymore.